Hello there. Today we're going through the slanted trouser pocket, and I think this will probably be the longest video yet because my first order of business is communicating the patterns to you. I'd recommend making paper patterns and then using those to cut ones out of calico or other fabric that you happen to have, because that'll make it simpler when it comes in a few weeks when I've got a video on putting a trouser together, possibly, or the other bits of the trouser maybe. That said, I think I did a pretty good job communicating them to you. That said, I'm not really the judge of that, am I? And all of that said, one of the videos in the description comes with a free printout of a slanted trouser pocket, so you can skip it with the timestamps also in the description. Something you definitely need for this though, is a pattern master or a quilting ruler. Basically a transparent ruler with markings, So,
starting with the facing, the long straight edge should be cut along the grain so that it can act as a stay tape or linen for the trouser fabric, which will be cut along a bias so it has a natural stretch that we don't really want or need. That straight edge is 27.5 centimeters. Then, at the top, go across 6 centimeters and down 2 to begin the next edge. Go down from there 23 centimeters and make notches from top to bottom at the 2 centimeter, 4 centimeter, and 22 centimeter point. The distance between the lower two notches, about 18 centimeters, represents the length of the pocket opening, which is usually about 17 or 18 centimeters. Go perpendicular out from that line less than a centimeter, like 8 millimeters. Go to the bottom of your first line and measure across 4.5 centimeters and down 1 centimeter. From this point, connect your two other lines. Finally, from the topmost point of your first line, measure down 2 centimeters for the last notch. Label your pattern and name the grain line, plus make sure that the notches are on the pattern so that you can copy them onto the fabric. This bit isn't technically a facing, but it is often called a facing. It's not important except that you know that it can be referred to as either the blind or the facing. Starting with the top edge, which is perpendicular to the grain, and measure 14 centimeters. From one corner, move perpendicular down 2 centimeters. Measure 2 centimeters out from there, down 21. From this point, make a diagonal line back to where you were. Move 1 centimeter back in, parallel to the top edge, perpendicular to the grain, not the diagonal line, the grain. Measure down another 4 centimeters and in another 1 centimeter. Parallel to the top edge, again, move in another 4 centimeters. Make a line between this point and the loose end of your top edge. There is another notch perpendicular down from your top edge by 2 centimeters on the diagonal line, so be sure to mark that. You're liable to notice that I mislabeled my patterns so far, so do be aware that they are both facings, but only the latter is referred to as a blind sometimes. Now, I'm all out of pattern paper and plain paper in general, so I'm just going to copy the pocket, usually cut from Silesia, straight out of calico. Starting with the top edge again, 29 centimeters, except it's curved. So at the center point, it drops down by about 7.5 millimeters. The easiest thing that I've found to do is use the blind or facing, or the blind facing, the facing blind, and making its top edge parallel with the curved edge of the pocket bag, and tracing the shape, and being sure to copy off the notches. move to the other side of the pocket bag, ignoring the 2 lines I've scribbled out, where we're going to make use of the other facing. Line its top edge against the curved top edge of the pocket and trace over it as well. When your facing moves in, follow that and carry it on a total of 3 centimeters. From your 2 edges now, find the midpoint. It should be about 38 centimeters between them. Then, at the top edge from the first side, measure 11 centimeters on the perpendicular line and then draw a line between that and the midpoint that you just found earlier. This is where you can determine the size of your pocket. You ought to cut it out and fold it along this final line you drew before cutting anything, because these are going to need to be sewn together. A neat curve will do for now. Now that you have your patterns for the special pieces, you'll need the bits that would normally be the leg. These are simpler though. There are 2 edges that you need to take care of. We don't necessarily need to get into specifics, so you'll start with a straight line perpendicular to the grain, and align the top edge of your facing piece that you already made to it. Trace down the edge with the notches, copying them off, and stop at the point where it juts out. Take away the pattern and draw a vertical line downwards. Segregate this pattern and you can cut it out. The back piece is a bit simpler. Pick a line perpendicular to the grain and go down about 11 centimeters and across 1 to 2 centimeters. From there, move down parallel to the grain, perpendicular to your first line, and keep going until the length is about the same as your front piece. It doesn't need to be, but it'll look pleasant. The curve creates a dart between the front and the back. And what we've made includes the extra allowance of about 2.5 centimeters, which is done for bespoke clothing, giving them extra fabric to be adjusted. And it's called the inlay, by the way. If you made the patterns rather than drafting them onto fabric, you ought to copy them onto fabric. Be sure to copy the notches before you cut them out, and it's good practice to make sure that the grain line you drew is parallel to the grain line of the fabric. This is going to be a little different than how it will be done when we are making a pair of trousers. This is because instead of 2 sets of everything, we have 1. For example, we would be mark stitching, not just basting between the notches that denote where the waistband is going to start and where the inlay starts. The inlay, like I said, is 2 to 3 centimeters extra on top of the pattern. Not the way I'm doing it, just moving the pattern back slightly. What we're going to do with the facings is mark a centimeter on their inside edges, which are going to be ironed down. I might have mark stitched these 2 if I were making a pair, and you'd better believe I'm not going to show you all the basting. You can do it, I'm sure. The same can be said for the ironing. The 2 ways of enfastening the pocket bag are by basting and felling it, or chalking the pocket and machining. I'd be remiss if I didn't show you both ways, and I'm sure you can determine where and when you'd like to use each of them. To machine them, you first need to mark where the stitch is going to be on the silesia. Line up the facings against where they are going to sit when you're done. Chalk where the ironed sides meet the pocket. Fold open the ironed creases and line it up on the chalk line, on the long chalk line. Baste or pin it in place. Machine down using the crease as a guide. Only on the long side though, because regardless, we are felling the short edge. Fold the facing back to where it's supposed to be and fel the short edge. When you're machining a pair of trousers, you'd usually have 2 different colors of thread in the bobbin and on the top. That way, it's both least visible against your silesia and top fabric. Just something to keep in mind. To hand sew the facings, align them to where they need to be, baste them in place, and fill them. You could do it with one continuous stitch if your thread is long enough. Now it comes to French seaming the pocket closed. It starts inside out because that's how French seams work. The blind facing, you want to check that the edge at the bottom of the pocket, where the ½ centimeter stitch will start and or end, doesn't intrude on the seam allowance. You can see me cutting it back a tiny bit, because otherwise you're seriously doubling up fabric. Machine the slisha and trim away the corner at the back and some chevrons on the curve. If you don't do that, the fabric will bunch up on the inside of the seam. Force the stitches to the edge, and I might baste it if it weren't practice. Maybe. Apparently I didn't film closing this seam, but you can fill in this particular blank for yourself, I'm sure. Flip it inside out again, as we're going to fix the front trouser. Your front trouser has identical notches to the slisha and that slisha's facing. Line up those notches and, of course, the edge, then machine between the notches and only between the two notches. You might find yourself with an easier job to chalk out the notches, making them more substantial. Then, you want to cut the notches right down to the line of stitching to make your next actions possible. Iron down the seam towards the pocket side. This will allow you to more easily keep this seam hidden. Baste the front trouser in place and then we'll prick stitch it down. I suggest chalking a line while you still can't reliably stitch a straight line. I suggest less than a centimeter, more than ½ centimeter. I've done ½ centimeter. And bear in mind that with a much thicker material you won't be able to simply send it through, not unlike stitching a D-tack. You'll have to push the needle down through and send it back up 2 to 3 millimeters ahead, rather than stitching with a nice smooth motion. To fix the top of the front trouser to the blind, we want to iron the front, which is currently sticking out atop the notch, to create a straight line going upwards, or a linear line. We also want to chalk the line that we're going to machine. So align your ruler against the pocket opening and chalk that linear line up to the top of the fabric. Move the slisha behind the blind out of the way and the slisha and facing out of the way too. Only the front and blind are being machined together. The best way I've found to get these two bits together is to have it sitting the way it would be when it's done, holding them there, then slip your hand in behind and just get your fingers to hold the seam in place, and fold the trouser front out of the way. Still holding it in place, pin it for machining. If you want to check that it's in the right place before committing to machining, put a pin along the seam and fold the front trouser back over. If it's wrong, just keep adjusting until it isn't wrong anymore. Stitch it right down to the notch, and it appears that I hadn't moved the slisha on the back out of the way. Do move it out of the way. You're only supposed to be stitching the 2 layers of fabric, and said stitch will be completely hidden. Having successfully attached the front, pay attention. Or maybe it was just me that found the next bit particularly difficult to wrap my head around. There is a small cut you need to make that will allow you to fold the Cilicia out of the way. You're cutting the blind at the bottom notch, but there is a little bit of the other side of Cilicia and its facing that will need to be chopped with it. You can see, I hope. The point is that you can fold the pocket out of the way of the front piece and the blind facing. Then, to keep these two together, we're going to make a very small line of stitching over them. Then, you're lining up the seam allowances of the front trouser and blind against the seam allowance of the back trouser. Don't forget about the inlay though. You mark the actual seam allowance with chalk and a basting stitch. The inlay is going to stick out while you're aligning your seams, and when you've sewn it for that matter. There's a thing called a zip foot, which is a type of sewing machine foot. It means that half the foot isn't there, allowing you to machine where you might have one flat side and the other side a bunch of fabric, like for example, just spitballing, a front trouser pocket folded out of the way. I don't have one of those. A zip foot, not a pocket trouser folded out of the way. If you don't either, your stitch is liable to be pushed off course and you'll end up with a bent line of stitching. Just go back over and try and correct it. What is also rather important is that the outside of the bottom pocket opening is where the back trouser meets the front. And then you'd go all the way down the leg connecting the front and back trouser piece. Next order of business is bar tacking the pocket opening and felling the Cilicia to the inlay. I won't go too deep into bar tacks because if I did what I planned to do, you should have gotten Hand Sewing Techniques Silk Thread Edition a fortnight ago. Begin though by ironing the seam open. The inlay is one piece to press backwards and the front features the blind and the front trouser. Fold back the Cilicia to get at the blind and fold up the pocket to get at the front. The bar tacks should be done at the exact points that the pocket opening starts and finishes. Me personally, I make my tacks so that it starts halfway through the prick stitch and then the mirrored amount on the other side. So with my 1/2 centimeter prick stitch, my bar tack catches 2.5 millimeters on both sides of the pocket opening. Then I go through to the other side and finish it off. It's still optional to coil it, but it's just that extra little bit of effort, isn't it? The last thing to do to finish the pocket is fel the Cilicia onto the inlay. Fold about 1 centimeter of the Cilicia inwards and baste them together. And then fel them. On a pair of trousers you'd need to attach a waistband, which we'll get into later, so you wouldn't want to remove the basting denoting the waistline. But you could remove the basting denoting the inlay, and of course the basting holding the inlay and the Cilicia together.
From this, it's not too hard to experiment with say, a straight pocket, maybe just changing the slant. I rather like having a small sub-pocket in my pocket. Keeps the keys from rattling. I'd suggest trying to make one with a check or a stripe. I just chalked out a check on some calico and, tried to see what I could do with that. And to clarify, the check or stripe on the front, blind and back trouser should all line up. But you knew that already. The next two things that we're going to do is the waistband and then the fly. And then maybe we'll be able to go for the whole hog. So, practice your cross stitch and see you in a fortnight.